At the height of the air war over Europe, when Berlin was becoming one of the most heavily defended targets in the world, few outside RAF Bomber Command knew the critical role played by a select unit known simply as the Pathfinders. These men, volunteers pulled from the most skilled crews in the service, were the first into enemy airspace, marking the target so the main force could follow. But buried deep in wartime memoranda and mission logs lies a lesser-known fact. In early 1943, 5 of these Pathfinder aircraft were quietly assigned to a classified flight over Berlin. Their task would push them deeper, lower, and earlier than any other formation that night. The mission originated at RAF Whiten, the nerve center of No. 8 Group, on a frigid January evening. Crews from No. 109 and No. 156 squadrons prepared their de Havilland Mosquitoes and Avro Lancasters for what had been described only as a calibration flight, tied to a new navigational aid still under evaluation. Rumors circulated across the tarmac that senior officers from the Directorate of Navigation had arrived earlier that day, an unusual presence, which immediately heightened anticipation and anxiety. For the Pathfinders, secrecy was not new, but a mission this veiled raised questions even among seasoned crews. The struggle facing the men was both technical and psychological. Night operations demanded a unique calm, a steady hand on the controls, unwavering concentration under stress, and the ability to interpret faint signals from new equipment that wasn't always reliable. One of the crew chiefs later wrote in his diary, "We trust the machines because we must, not because they deserve it." Navigational aids like OBO and H2S radar were still experimental and prone to interference, but Bomber Command relied on them to find the heart of Germany in total darkness. Berlin was over 550 miles from England, meaning the slightest miscalculation could leave a crew hopelessly lost or drifting into flak belts no aircraft could survive. In briefing rooms lit by a single bulb, Group Captain Donald Bennett, the relentless architect of the Pathfinder force, outlined the operation. His instructions were brief. The 5 aircraft would depart several minutes ahead of the mainstream, test the new navigation device along a predetermined route, and then mark the industrial district in central Berlin for the approaching squadrons. But there were subtle cues indicating deeper stakes. Maps were stamped with red classification markings. Charts lacked the usual contingency fields. And the men were told that no radio transmissions were to be made unless absolutely necessary. By 1940 hours, engines thundered across Whiten. The crews climbed into icy skies, forming a staggered trail before heading southeast toward the Dutch coast. At this stage of the journey, everything followed standard procedure. Ground observers tracking their climb noted clean, precise formations, exactly what was expected from the Pathfinders. Yet embedded in the radar reports, historians later noticed an anomaly. The 5 aircraft separated from the main bomber stream earlier than their logbooks indicated. Whether this was deliberate or a response to an undisclosed signal remains one of several questions surrounding the flight. As they crossed the North Sea, tension grew. Heavy winds buffeted the aircraft, and the Pathfinders began monitoring the new navigation receiver, described in after-action notes only as Instrument X. Its readings fluctuated more than expected. Some crew members suspected German countermeasures. Others chalked it up to the typical quirks of wartime electronics. But then came the first concerning clue. Operators at RAF Cranwell picked up faint, fragmented transmissions, short bursts of static-laced speech suggesting abrupt course corrections. Though unintelligible, they were concerning enough for intelligence officers to flag them. The air crews, however, had no choice but to continue. This was the paradox of the Pathfinder role. They entered danger first, alone, with the knowledge that the success of hundreds of bombers depended on their precision. One navigator later described flying into Berlin's defenses as walking into a furnace while the door was still closing. The Germans had spent years perfecting the city's anti-aircraft system. Searchlights crisscrossed the sky in rigid patterns, and radar-controlled flak guns fired blind barrages at any approaching formation. What no one realized at the time was that this mission, intended to support the night's major raid, had quietly become far more significant. In the shadows of the war room, planners hoped the flight would validate a new navigational method capable of striking deep inside Germany with unprecedented accuracy. If proven successful, it could change the course of the strategic bombing campaign. But pushing new technology into hostile airspace carried risks that were neither recorded nor fully understood. As the 5 Pathfinders closed in on the outskirts of Berlin, they approached the most perilous phase of the mission, one that would have consequences none of the crews could foresee. Their final movements, still debated decades later, remained shrouded by incomplete signals, lost logs, and the deadly fog of war. The mystery was only beginning. By the time the 5 Pathfinder aircraft crossed the Dutch coastline, the night sky had transformed into a battlefield of invisible forces, radar beams, encrypted transmissions, and roaming Luftwaffe fighters hunting by electronic scent. What most airmen didn't know was that early 1943 marked a turning point in the technological duel over Europe. For the first time, German night fighter control centers were integrating new Freya and Würzburg radar arrays with an expanding network of searchlights and anti-aircraft batteries. The shifting balance meant that even the elite Pathfinders, flying with the latest British equipment, could no longer rely solely on their speed and training to evade detection. The struggle began with small signs that something was wrong. As the formation passed over the blacked-out Dutch countryside, operators at RAF monitoring stations in Lincolnshire noted intermittent distortions in the signals sent by the Pathfinder's newly trialed navigation system. The interference didn't resemble typical atmospheric static. Instead, it appeared rhythmic, patterned, suggesting either deliberate jamming or a technical fault inside the equipment itself. Meanwhile, inside the cockpits, navigators began to notice discrepancies between expected bearings and what their new device, Instrument X, displayed on its flickering screen. For most crews, these discrepancies would have triggered radio checks, but the mission's strict silence instructions meant improvisation was their only option. Sergeant Arthur Linton, one of the radio operators aboard the Lancaster from No. 156 Squadron, later described in his personal notes, "We kept glancing at the new set, hoping it would settle. You could feel the tension. When the equipment you're meant to test becomes your only guide, and that guide starts to falter, your stomach tightens." As if sensing this vulnerability, the Luftwaffe pounced. Just past 21:15 hours, ground controllers operating within the Kamhuber line detected a small cluster of aircraft diverging from the main British bomber stream. The pattern matched neither typical Mosquito reconnaissance flights nor the predictable timing of Halifax and Lancaster formations. German officers dispatched several Bf-110 and Ju-88 night fighters from airfields in Leeuwarden and Twente, their pilots guided by radar operators trained to shepherd unsuspecting bombers toward deadly interception zones. The clash came swiftly. Fragmented British radio transmissions, captured by listening posts at RAF Coltishall, hinted at abrupt course changes and evasive maneuvers. One transmission clearly recorded the call sign Vixen Leader, followed by the words, "Turning port, now," before dissolving into static. Another signal, shorter but more urgent, mentioned flares and 2 below, suggesting that at least one Pathfinder was being tracked by enemy fighters maneuvering into attack position. And yet, remarkably, no confirmed shootdowns were logged by the Luftwaffe for that time and location. This discrepancy has puzzled historians for decades. If night fighters intercepted the Pathfinders, why were there no matching kill claims? Some analysts argue that German pilots may have mistaken the high-speed Mosquitoes for decoys and broken contact. Others point to a different possibility: counter-jamming from the British side. 1943 saw the rapid introduction of window, thin strips of foil dropped from aircraft to confuse radar operators. Though officially deployed later that year, classified trials of the concept were already in motion. If the Pathfinders carried early versions, they may have inadvertently blinded both friend and foe. Declassified German records introduce a further layer of complexity. A surviving log from Nachtjagerschwader 1 mentions unusual interference in the radio frequencies used for night fighter coordination around 21:30 hours, forcing controllers to rely on visual sightings instead of radar vectors. Several pilots reported chasing shadows, contacts that vanished from their screens despite strong radar returns moments earlier. These disruptions coincided precisely with when the 5 Pathfinders were believed to be adjusting course toward Berlin. The reveal came years later when aviation historian Dr. Michael Reynolds analyzed the RAF's radar data from that night. His report noted that the formation's flight paths, reconstructed from incomplete returns, showed strange angular movements around the Dutch-German border. One aircraft appeared to veer sharply north, another dropped altitude without explanation, while the remaining 3 maintained course but spread out more widely than usual. Reynolds theorized that the experimental navigation device may have misread German radar reflections, causing navigators to overcorrect their headings, and thus drift into isolated pockets of enemy airspace. If true, this would also explain the eerie silence in the Luftwaffe kill records. The Pathfinders may have moved through defended corridors too quickly or erratically for night fighters to engage effectively. Yet even the most technical assessments fail to address one final clue: the last intelligible transmission recorded from the formation, timed at 21:44. It was just 2 words: course lost. After that, nothing. No distress signals. No altitude reports. No formation check-ins. Those listening in the British monitoring stations that night described the sudden quiet as unnatural, as though the 5 aircraft had slipped behind a curtain where radio waves could no longer follow. In hindsight, this moment stands as the point where routine uncertainty turned into genuine mystery. The Pathfinders had survived radar interference, enemy fighters and equipment malfunctions, but the worst of their ordeal still lay ahead. Just beyond the German frontier, the lights of Berlin were pulsing in the distance, and the city's defenses were already preparing for their arrival. Berlin, even from miles away, announced itself long before its skyline appeared. Crews often described the glow that rose from the capital as a dome of fire, a mix of industrial haze, searchlight beams, and the faint red hue of distant explosions. On the night of the Pathfinder's disappearance, January 1943, that glow seemed to pulse across the horizon like a warning. As the 5 aircraft approached the northern approaches of the city, the tension inside each cockpit grew more pronounced. Their mission was to mark the target area for the main bomber stream, but something had already gone wrong. A navigational drift had scattered the formation, making coordination nearly impossible. The struggle intensified as Berlin's formidable air defense network came to life. Operating with ruthless precision, the city's defense grid was built on 2 interconnected pillars: radar-guided anti-aircraft guns and a dense web of searchlights designed to trap aircraft in blinding cones of white. Thousands of gunners staffed batteries ringing the city, while operators working the Würzburg radar arrays tracked every British aircraft approaching the metropolitan airspace. For the Pathfinders, the first sign of the danger ahead came in the form of distant flak bursts, white-orange flashes erupting in the night sky, growing larger with every mile. Inside one of the Lancasters, Flying Officer David Keene's crew attempted to adjust to the worsening conditions. Keene's navigator, Flight Sergeant Edgar Loft, noticed that their H-2S radar display began to distort as they approached the outskirts of Oranienburg. What should have shown a clear outline of Berlin's lakes and rail lines appeared instead as smudged, erratic shadows. Loft scribbled a note in the margin of his chart: radar unreliable. Possible jamming? But the crew lacked time to diagnose the issue. They needed to stay on course, find their marking point, and avoid the expanding arcs of flak ahead. Meanwhile, another Pathfinder, a Mosquito from No. 109 Squadron, reported an abrupt elevation change in its altimeter readings. Though the transmission was faint, a monitoring station in the UK logged the phrase, "readings off, correcting," before the signal cut. Analysts later suggested that the Mosquito may have descended to evade predicted flak bursts. But lower altitude brought new dangers. German night fighters often lurked just above the city's defensive belts, waiting for bombers to drop into their kill zones. It was here, just outside Berlin's northern sector, that events took their strangest turn. Royal Air Force radar plots from that night reveal that the 5 Pathfinders became increasingly difficult to track. 3 aircraft showed diminishing returns, their radar echoes fading until they vanished entirely. One aircraft, likely the Mosquito, executed a sweeping turn eastward before its signal dropped abruptly. The last Lancaster emitted a brief return near Hennigsdorf, then disappeared without transmitting a final position report. No normal atmospheric disturbance or German radar jamming pattern fully explains the simultaneous disappearance of multiple aircraft from British radar screens. Eyewitness accounts from other crews add further layers of confusion. A Halifax pilot returning from Berlin later told debriefing officers, "We saw flak everywhere, but there were moments where the sky just seemed empty, quiet, like something had moved through before we got there." Another pilot reported seeing 3 small silhouettes at high altitude veering off in different directions, but he could not identify them in the chaos of the defenses. Berlin's anti-aircraft fire that night was among the fiercest on record. The Germans, alerted early by reconnaissance radar, believed a major raid was imminent and unleashed their full defensive capability. Shells detonated at preset altitudes, exploding in patterns designed to herd bombers into predictable corridors. The Pathfinders, already disoriented by their malfunctioning navigation equipment, had no choice but to maneuver blindly through a deadly maze. One miscalculated turn could send them plunging into concentrated fire or pushing too far off course to rejoin the formation. And yet, no confirmed wreckage from the 5 aircraft was ever found within the Berlin defensive perimeter. This is where the mystery deepens. The main bomber stream recorded heavy losses that night, and several downed aircraft were recovered in the days that followed. But none matched the serial numbers of the missing Pathfinders. Even German post-war reports, which meticulously catalogued crash sites and captured crews, show no trace of 5 additional downed aircraft in the region. Historians examining mission logs decades later pointed to one curious line in a classified Bomber Command report: "Contact lost in area north of Berlin. Believed navigation anomaly, prolonged exposure in hostile zones." But the wording "believed" suggests that even senior intelligence officers lacked confidence in their assessment. The reveal comes in the form of a single, unsettling observation recorded by a radar operator at RAF Trimingham. At 22:12 hours during the peak of the raid, he observed what he called sudden blanking on his receiver, a momentary dead zone where reflections from multiple aircraft vanished simultaneously. This blanking lasted less than 10 seconds, after which only the main bomber force reappeared. Were the Pathfinders inside that blanked zone? And if so, what caused it? Some modern analysts suggest rare atmospheric conditions could have refracted radar beams. Others believe German electronic countermeasures may have inadvertently cloaked the aircraft from detection. But no definitive explanation has emerged. The close of this chapter leaves us with an unresolved truth. Somewhere between Oranienburg and central Berlin, 5 expert crews entered a space where signals, sightings, and certainty all disappeared. And as the night pressed on, the boundaries between navigational error, enemy interference, and pure wartime chaos grew impossibly thin. Their fate would only become more mysterious as dawn approached. By dawn on January 17, 1943, RAF Whiten had become a place suspended between routine and dread. Ground crews gathered on the freezing tarmac, scanning the horizon in hopes of seeing the familiar silhouettes of returning Pathfinders. But as the minutes stretched into hours, it became clear that the 5 aircraft, 2 Mosquitoes and 3 Lancasters, were not simply delayed. They were missing. In Bomber Command, aircraft went down almost every night, but the disappearance of an entire Pathfinder element, deployed on a classified assignment, sent a shock through No. 8 Group headquarters. The struggle began in the aftermath. Standard procedure called for immediate attempts to establish radio contact, but none of the frequencies yielded a single response. By mid-morning, senior officers convened an emergency meeting inside Whiten's operations room. Among the attendees was Group Captain Don Bennett, the architect of the Pathfinder force, known for his precision and ferociously high standards. Bennett was terse, leaning over a map marked with the aircraft's last approximate positions. "They don't all vanish," he reportedly said, "not without reason." His frustration was evident. The Pathfinders were his creation, and losing 5 at once was an operational and personal blow. The first impulse was to organize air searches. But the region north of Berlin, marshland, forests, and snow-covered fields, was deep inside German territory. RAF rescue flights could not simply sweep across enemy lines without becoming targets themselves. Instead, analysts in the Bomber Command War Room reviewed reconnaissance photographs from the early dawn sorties. These images captured several newly discovered wrecks across northern Germany, but none matched the known serial numbers of the missing Pathfinders. The locations were wrong, the patterns of wreckage inconsistent, and the spacing too far from the Pathfinder's last radar traces. This absence raised questions that intelligence officers hesitated to record in files. One internal note, partially redacted even decades later, suggests anomalous distribution of debris inconsistent with recorded flight path. In other words, nothing lined up. The typical chaos of wartime documentation couldn't fully explain why there was no trace of 5 aircraft expected to have crashed within a few dozen miles of their last known positions. Then came the first insight from captured German records. In 1945, after the fall of the Third Reich, Allied intelligence teams collected a vast archive of Luftwaffe documents. Among them was a brief report from the German air defense sector covering the night of the Pathfinder's disappearance. One entry referenced a small RAF group intercepted north of Oranienburg shortly after 2200 hours. No aircraft types were listed, and no shootdowns were confirmed. The lack of details is striking. German night fighter units were notoriously meticulous about claiming victories. Every downing required coordinates, altitude, and witness confirmation. The absence of such information prompted later historians to wonder whether the German controllers themselves were confused by the strange radar activity reported that night. Additional testimony from former Luftwaffe night fighter pilots only deepened the mystery. Interviews conducted in the 1960s with veterans from Jagdgeschwader 1 revealed that several pilots recalled experiencing severe radar distortion as they approached Berlin's defense sectors. One pilot, Hauptmann Karl-Heinz Rumpf, described it, "Our screens flickered. Contacts appeared, then vanished. We were flying blind for minutes at a time." When asked whether they had engaged a small RAF formation, Rumpf insisted he had seen only faint shadows at altitude, uncertain whether they were real aircraft or false echoes. These accounts matched the broader pattern of that night, an airspace filled with confusion. Between German countermeasures, experimental British jamming techniques, and the natural interference common in midwinter conditions, the sky over Berlin had become an unpredictable environment. But such confusion doesn't account for the complete lack of crash sites. The reveal came in the form of a lesser-known operational summary discovered in a 1978 review of wartime archives. It noted that the Luftwaffe recorded multiple unidentified returns, traveling at unusually steady speed and altitude north of Berlin before vanishing abruptly. Analysts at the time theorized that these might have been British aircraft attempting to escape the thick flak belts by flying toward the Baltic. If the Pathfinders tried such a maneuver, they could have crashed in remote woodland or lakes, some of which remain difficult to access even today. Yet, if they had crashed, why did no German unit report discovering the wrecks? This leads to a possible modern reflection. Wartime reporting systems, both Allied and Axis, were far from perfect. Paperwork was delayed, misfiled, or destroyed during chaotic retreats. Entire incidents were occasionally lost in the bureaucracy of military collapse. But in this case, the missing documentation feels disproportionately large. 5 missing aircraft, each with a crew of highly trained specialists, should have left a trail. They did not. The close of Part 4 brings the narrative to a critical juncture. With no wreckage, no survivors, and no confirmed German interceptions, the disappearance of the Pathfinders began transitioning from a tactical failure into a historical enigma. Intelligence officers, unable to draw firm conclusions, were left with more questions than answers. Somewhere north of Berlin, in a landscape marked by destruction and confusion, the truth remained buried, waiting for discoveries that would only come years later, and still fail to solve the mystery entirely. And as investigators moved into the post-war years, a new piece of evidence would surface, one that shifted the focus away from the battlefield and toward classified British technology. In the years following the war, the disappearance of the 5 Pathfinder aircraft settled into a quiet corner of RAF history, acknowledged, recorded, but never fully explained. That changed in 1947, when British intelligence analysts began reviewing captured German documents for patterns related to Allied losses. It was during this exhaustive process that a thin, dust-covered file from Luftwaffe Reich came to light. Inside was a brief statement referencing an intercepted RAF group north of Oranienburg, containing only a few sparse details. No aircraft types, no crew descriptions, no confirmed shoot-downs. The report stood out precisely because of what it lacked. The struggle for answers became more intricate when analysts cross-checked the German entry with Bomber Command's records. The timing aligned almost exactly with when the 5 Pathfinders were last detected on RAF radar. But again, the German side made no official kill claims for that time frame. Given the rigor with which the Luftwaffe logged their aerial victories, each requiring altitude, coordinates, and witness corroboration, the omission was striking. It suggested one of two possibilities. Either the German controllers never visually confirmed the aircraft, or the engagement was so chaotic that no one could determine precisely what had happened. Further insights emerged from post-war interrogations of Luftwaffe night fighter pilots. Years later, in interviews conducted for the British Air Ministry's Air Historical Branch, several German veterans from Nachtjagerschwader 1 and Nachtjagerschwader 5 recalled unusual difficulties during the night in question. One pilot, Oberfeldwebel Heinrich Mahler, described the situation as an evening of ghosts. His recollection was vivid. Our radar operators weren't certain what they were seeing. Targets blinked in and out. We chased shapes that weren't there and sometimes lost shapes that were. Pilots on both sides were accustomed to electronic warfare anomalies, but the consistency of these recollections raised eyebrows among researchers. The Luftwaffe had experimented with radio frequency distortion, attempts to jam Allied radar and disrupt the bombing stream's cohesion. Yet the pilots insisted that what they experienced exceeded anything they had encountered before. One theorized that Allied aircraft might have been carrying early jamming devices, prototypes of equipment that wouldn't be officially deployed until later in the war. This claim aligned with a growing suspicion inside British intelligence circles. The 5 missing Pathfinders were part of an operational test of a new navigation technology. Though details remain classified even decades later, hints appeared in a handful of declassified RAF memos referencing a special equipment calibration sortie conducted on the night of the loss. The equipment was believed to be a modification of OBO or H2S radar, systems designed to help the Pathfinders locate and mark targets in total darkness. If the prototype malfunctioned near Berlin's dense radar environment, the aircraft could have inadvertently flown further off course than anyone anticipated. The reveal came in 1968, when a retired RAF intelligence officer, Wing Commander Harold Dyer, published a memoir that referenced severe gaps in Luftwaffe kill claims for the night in question. His book briefly mentioned that several British analysts believed enemy radar interference might have pushed parts of the bomber stream into uncharted airspace. Dyer wrote, "It was one of the few nights where neither side fully understood the electromagnetic storm they were fighting through." This comment intrigued historians because it hinted at a technological conflict that was still poorly understood. Radar systems in the early 1940s were temperamental and susceptible to misreading atmospheric reflections. In winter, particularly near frozen lakes and snow-covered terrain, signals could scatter unpredictably, creating false echoes or causing real aircraft to vanish from screens. If the Pathfinder's prototype navigation gear relied on interpreting those reflections, it may have introduced errors that no crew could correct in the heat of combat. Modern analysts often cite one additional clue: a Luftwaffe night fighter log noting that 3 unidentified aircraft were briefly spotted near Oranienburg, flying unusually steady and level before turning northward, away from Berlin and toward the more isolated Baltic hinterlands. This contradicts expectations. Under fire, crews typically dove, weaved, or scattered. But a group flying steady and level suggests determination, possibly an attempt to escape the thickest flak belts by diverting north. If this was indeed the Pathfinders, their course change might have taken them into sparsely populated woodland where crash sites could go unreported. But this theory only deepens the mystery. If they crashed in remote terrain, why were no wrecks found after the war, when Allied survey teams scoured Germany for missing aircraft? Why were no parachutes reported, no prisoner of war records created, no bodies recovered? The application of modern investigative methods has yielded limited insight. Satellite mapping has identified several bodies of water capable of swallowing an aircraft whole. Forested areas north of Oranienburg remain dense and difficult to search even today. Some theorists suggest that spring floods or wartime debris clearing may have buried evidence. Others argue that the aircraft might have crossed further north than previously believed, placing them near Baltic marshlands where recovery would have been nearly impossible. Still, the most perplexing element remains the same. The Luftwaffe documented no victories, no debris, and no captures related to the missing Pathfinders. 5 aircraft do not simply vanish without a trace, yet that is precisely what happened. As the investigation moved into the 1970s and 1980s, archivists uncovered a final piece of information that shifted attention back to the British side. A set of declassified files hinting at suppressed details about the experimental equipment on board the Pathfinders. And in Part 6, these revelations bring the mystery to its most unsettling point, where technology, secrecy, and wartime chaos intersect in a way no historian has fully untangled. For decades, the official RAF explanation for the disappearance of the 5 Pathfinders relied on a familiar wartime narrative: navigational error, enemy defenses, and the inherent chaos of operating deep inside hostile territory. But in 1984, more than 40 years after the mission, a small cache of declassified documents quietly shifted the ground beneath that explanation. Filed under the Directorate of Navigation, these papers referenced a prototype navigation aid tested only a handful of times in operational conditions. And on the night the Pathfinders vanished, all 5 aircraft carried components of that system. The hook of these files came in a single line typed on yellowing paper: calibration accuracy unverified, risk acceptable given operational necessity. The sentence suggested that the crews had been asked to rely on an instrument whose reliability was still in question. Even more striking was the implication that the high-risk test was intentionally conducted over Berlin, the most heavily defended airspace in Europe. Why choose such a perilous environment to evaluate unproven technology? The answer, many historians believe, lies in RAF Bomber Command's escalating pressure to improve accuracy after several costly raids in late 1942. The struggle facing the crews becomes clearer when reading the internal memos that accompanied the declassified files. Early prototypes of oboe and H-2S radar had shown promise, but they were notoriously sensitive to atmospheric interference, particularly over cities with dense clusters of metal structures and industrial complexes. Engineers suspected Berlin's radar environment would distort the readings, but they lacked data. The Pathfinders, already the most skilled and disciplined crews in Bomber Command, were the only units trusted to gather it under live combat conditions. A note from Wing Commander Basil Jeffries, dated 2 weeks before the mission, was especially revealing: operational testing to proceed. Crews selected based on aptitude and reliability. Outcome to be recorded discreetly. That final phrase, recorded discreetly, suggests that senior officers anticipated complications or even failure. Yet the existence of these memos was kept from most of Number 8 Group, leaving the Pathfinders unaware that they were working with equipment whose risks were not fully understood. While the declassified files shed new light on the mission's purpose, they did little to explain the fate of the aircraft. This is where another discovery, found not in British archives but in a post-war analysis conducted by NATO researchers, added a new layer of complexity. During the Cold War, Western analysts revisited several World War II-era incidents to study the reliability of early radar and jamming systems. One report noted significant electromagnetic distortion, recorded over northern Germany on the night the Pathfinders disappeared. It theorized that a rare combination of weather conditions, radar emissions, and ground reflections might have interfered simultaneously with both Allied and Axis systems. This insight has become one of the most credible explanations for what happened next. If the experimental navigation system responded unpredictably to the distortion, and all available evidence suggests it did, the crews may have been unaware of how far off course they had drifted. A characteristic of early radar-based navigation was its vulnerability to false range readings, ghost signals that appear identical to real ones. When operators unknowingly follow these ghosts, they can fly miles from their intended path without realizing the error. If all 5 aircraft experienced this error simultaneously, their gradual divergence from the planned route might explain why none reached the marking point over Berlin. The reveal grows sharper when cross-examining German and British radar logs. Both show blank zones appearing within minutes of each other, areas where returns should have appeared but didn't. Analysts in 1943 could not explain these anomalies. Modern engineers suggest that the prototype device may have inadvertently interfered with nearby frequencies, creating a feedback loop that obscured both the aircraft and ground-based reflections. In effect, the Pathfinders may have flown into a region where they were invisible to both sides. With the crews effectively flying blind, the probable outcomes narrow into 2 historical possibilities. They crashed in remote woodland or marshland north of Berlin, where debris may still lie buried under decades of regrowth. Or they continued drifting north, ultimately running out of fuel over the Baltic Sea, an area known for swallowing entire aircraft without leaving surface traces. Each theory carries weight, but neither is confirmable with available evidence. Even post-war German surveys never accounted for wreckage consistent with the missing airframes. And no British or German unit reported captured survivors. The final application comes in the form of modern military analysis. Early navigation and radar systems were astonishingly fragile. Calibrating them in the chaos of wartime airspace, especially over a city saturated with radar emissions, was a gamble. The Pathfinders, equipped with a device that may have misled them at the worst possible moment, were operating on the cutting edge of a technology whose flaws were invisible until tragedy exposed them. And so the story closes with the question that continues to haunt historians: how can 5 advanced crews flying some of the best aircraft in the RAF vanish without a trace? Perhaps the most sobering conclusion is also the simplest. In the labyrinth of the night sky over Berlin, thick with flak, choked with radar beams, and distorted by winter weather, the perfect storm of technological error and operational risk created a moment from which no crew could recover. The records end, but the mystery remains. Their names endure on memorial walls, their aircraft still unaccounted for, their mission partially declassified but never fully understood. The 5 Pathfinders disappeared into a night shaped by innovation, uncertainty, and the unforgiving reality of total war, and despite decades of research, no one has followed them into the darkness and returned with the truth.